The tree of knowledge is one that has confused a lot of readers of the Bible in understanding what it is and its relationship to Adam and Eve. To be clear, we are not going to be doing a deep dive of Genesis 2 and 3 in terms of creation, Eden, the serpent, or the fall. Simply, what we can understand about the tree itself is going to be our focus. The first time this tree appears within the text is Genesis 2:9, where Yahweh plants it and the tree of life. We then hear of it again in 2:17 and as one of the major focal points of Genesis 3. Many have believed that this tree is merely dealing with moral knowledge, and therefore Adam and Eve had no understanding of right and wrong until they ate of it. However, we do not have to turn to the Hebrew to notice that there is a merism taking place. A merism is a rhetorical device which uses contrasting parts to indicate totality. Example, head to toe or heaven and earth. Scholar John Walton states that, yet as a merism, it should not be thought of as referring to all knowledge. Instead, it applies to the range within a specific category of knowledge, good and evil. Like words, rhetorical devices such as merism can be understood only as we explore their usage. This is something that can be noticed in the English as well as in passages similar to it, such as Genesis 24:50, 31:24, 2 Samuel 14:17, and 1 Kings 3:9, as well as many others. However, this does not stop people from assuming immediately about what they believe the tree is about. Most assume that this is about strictly having moral judgment, never mind the fact that this doesn't fit the context of the passage or the grammar. It is hard to hold someone morally responsible for moral choices when they do not have any form of moral judgment. It does not seem that this is merely about knowing what is good and evil as we often think it means. Nor does it point to the idea that the tree is poisonous. The tree is not what is wrong, but how Adam and Eve go about it is what is wrong. So if the tree is not merely about moral knowledge, then what is it about? For this, we will have to turn to the Hebrew to unpack this further. The word used for knowledge of is da'at, of which can be understood as discernment and understanding. The Lexham Theological Wordbook states, knowledge was not inherently good nor evil. Rather, the content of one's knowledge dictated its merit. Positively, da'at was used in poetic narrative alongside other Hebrew words meaning wisdom, understanding, and skill to complete a task, such as in Exodus 31:3, 35:31, and 1 Kings 7:14. Negatively, da'at was used to belong to someone who has come to have knowledge of evil through detrimental actions, such as Genesis 2:9, Genesis 2:17, and Isaiah 47:10. Famously, Proverbs 1:7 states that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of da'at. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Within the context of Proverbs 1:7, we see that wisdom is also linked with knowledge. When we turn back to Genesis 2:9, we also see the words good and evil. These are by no means mistranslations. After all, these are the right words to use. However, it should be pointed out that we often have certain baggage we bring with our understanding of these words that do not properly match the way the Hebrew is using it in its meaning. Working backwards with evil, the word used here is ra. Evil can be connected to ra, but also there are Hebrew words that deal specifically with moral evil. This word has a broader scope than we tend to allow it. The Hebrew and Aramaic Lexicon of the Old Testament points out that the word can also be understood as poor, not beneficial, bad, heavy, sullen, and of little worth. This is not necessarily or simply about moral evil, but of that which is displeasurable. There are many things in life that we find to be of little worth or displeasurable that are not in and of themselves morally evil, but evil most certainly is displeasurable. This is why some scholars take to calling this tree the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Bad being used to play the opposite of good in the Hebrew without forcing it to immediately mean moral evil. With that in mind, we might as well come to understand good. Tov is similar to ra in that it is not necessarily a moral word, but can still apply to morality. This word can be understood as also pleasant, merry, desirable, in order, kind, efficient, and usable. These words play into an understanding of what is desirable and undesirable, what is pleasant and unpleasant. Yes, morality falls into these categories, but to say that this tree solely deals with morality would not at all do it justice. It ignores the rest of what fits in the Hebrew terminology. Kenneth Mackie states, more likely the tree bestowed a divine wisdom. It has been long recognized that the features of the garden story bear strong resemblance to wisdom literature and themes. The wisdom tradition declares that wisdom is possessed by God and is humanity's proper goal of attainment. We see in Proverbs 1:7 that this can be achieved through the fear of the Lord, rather than us independently reaching for it. We also see in other wisdom literature, such as Job, that there are some things in wisdom that are limited to Yahweh. Are you the first man who was born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God? And do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? This is also affirmed by the narrator of Genesis in describing Eve's view of the tree in Genesis 3. So when the woman saw the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, or the ESV notes could also be translated as insight. We also ought to remember that God is the source of life, wisdom, and knowledge. It can then be noted that since the tree was present, although prohibited, that this would be something that God would teach them and guide them with, meaning that this is not a narrative designed to test Adam and Eve, but it does probe questions during their temptation and even in our own temptations of whether or not we will rely on God to guide us or take of our own understanding selfishly. We then see the tree reappear by the full name in verse 16 through 17. And Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, From every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die. We notice that God gives Adam ample permission, but only a single prohibition. This is important to note, as many make the mistake in saying that the tree of life was off limits, but Adam was only told to not eat of the tree of wisdom. However, this is not because the tree of wisdom is the antithesis of the tree of life, for God is the source of all life and knowledge. The phrase "in the day" has caused some to be confused in what the text exactly is implying here. The reason is that later when Adam and Eve ultimately eat of the tree, they do not die in that day. This has led many to assume that either God decided to not punish them, or that they died spiritually. To be clear, Call to Defend does agree that Adam and Eve spiritually died that day, but it also must be noted that this would not have been a concept that was on the mind of the original author, but a New Testamental truth that we can look back on and see. The early Jews would have seen this differently. We want to make sure we understand the way they would have in order to try and get a fuller understanding of the text with the Old and New Testament in mind. Within scholarship, it is debated on if the phrase should be translated as "in the day" or "when." Part of the reason is due to the rest of the context, and the other reason is that "ha," which is a Hebrew definite article, is not in the text. This does not mean that this is a mistranslation, as the point of the translation is to capture what these words would mean in our language. This debate can be seen in the ESV and the NIV, where the ESV states "in the day" and the NIV states "when." Wenham states, "Nor can the contradiction between this warning, the snake's remark, and the conclusion of the story be resolved by retranslating 'on the day' as 'when.' Though this phrase can mean vaguely 'when,' it tends to emphasize promptness of action." Wenham's point seems to be that the translation does not really change much of the conversation. John Walton, however, argues that he believes the NIV has the correct translation based upon an example found in Jeremiah 26:8-11. Jeremiah 26:8 uses the same phrase as we have in Genesis 2:17, but it is Jeremiah 26:11 that shows us exactly what the people mean by using that phrase in verse 8. When they say "you will surely die," they are talking about the eventual outcome of the behavior. The sentence will be passed, the doom will be fixed. This phrase is also used in historical literature to pass sentence on offenders of various kinds. The resulting paraphrase of Genesis 2:17 then is, "When you eat of it, you will be sentenced to death and therefore doomed to die. Consequently, death will be a certainty." Hamilton provides this passage as an example of a death decree not carried out, but argues that there are several other passages that result in death. However, this does not really negate Walton's point, as Hamilton agrees that the Jeremiah passage uses the term without an immediate promptness of death, as well as 1 Samuel 14:44, which can be understood as "you deserve to die," and then Ezekiel having 3 occurrences where the same Hebrew phrase for death can leave room for pardon based upon repentance. Ultimately, the argument comes down to the context of the passage. In this instance, we would see the result in chapter 3 that they do not physically die immediately, but they are removed from the garden, from the presence of God, and from the tree of life. The tree itself is not the killer, nor is it the wisdom, but how Adam and Eve go about obtaining the wisdom, through disobedience and rejection of receiving wisdom from God. It was in their own sin that they brought death and separation from God by replacing Yahweh with themselves out of a distrust for Him. But why place a tree there just to prohibit it? Some argue it is so that God can test Adam and Eve, and while God does test us for our own benefits, this leaves some wondering if God has set them up to fail. This will also make the tree a trick, as some argue. They argue that God is holding out on them. Walton argues, rather than God's putting the tree there simply to test Adam and Eve, it is more in keeping with his character to understand that the tree would have use in the future. When the time was right, the first couple would be able to eat from it. It could be then argued that the issue of the tree is a matter of timing. They were not yet ready, but that doesn't mean that they would never be ready. They had the capacity to grow. After all, they were image bearers. However, they were being taught and matured by God through their faith, love, trust, and obedience that He knows what is best. We must remember that the tree is not evil. It was created by God and planted by God. It is important to understand that this helps us and understand the Genesis narrative itself. It will also raise more questions for us in reflecting. What we must remember is that Scripture is not merely designed to tell us what happened, but to make theological points and to sharpen us through deeper thinking on the passages. We can come to understand that true wisdom comes from God, and that we can trust that He will provide and guide us through life in our journey of gaining wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom after all, and we can trust that He will help us understand even if things do not make sense in the present. Often things come with time and relying on His timing instead, which is far greater than taking matters into our own hands and rushing things. This is not the sole point of Genesis 2 and 3, but a component in understanding the nature of sin in humanity. Sin is self-focused. It takes matters into our own hands based on what seems good and right to us, even with things that are not inherently wrong to begin with. Often the devil can tempt us with what is wicked, but he can also tempt us with what appears to be good so that it takes our focus off of God. Sometimes it can also be something that God does not have for us currently or ever, but we often try to think that we can take it there. An example of this may be of a leadership position in the church. You may be called to a position in the church, but you may be rushing the procedure of which you get there when God is maturing you for it. You also may not be called to a specific position, even though you have the gift for it. All offices can be filled with people who have the gifts to fill them, but not all people with those gifts are meant to fill them. We rely on God to know the boundaries so we can do the work that He actually has for us, instead of taking what seems right to us in disobedience and therefore harming others. The tree of knowledge was not the sin, but going about it in disobedience was. God is the ultimate source of knowledge and wisdom. Are we going to sit at His feet and learn, or go about gaining it apart from Him?